rejection of the Enlightenment ends up being just a rejection of reason wholesale, even if people are slow to make that direct claim, or to state outright that they want to reject reason. I think that what's happened is that critiques of the Enlightenment, which usually rely on argumentation and reasonable analysis that sort of comes from the Enlightenment, are taken up to be excuses to reject reason and human will and human intervention in the world altogether. It's similar to the way critiques of technology are used to reject industrial or technological society altogether, which I think is equally mistaken.
So, kind of like, I think this sort of thing you're talking about is exemplified in the, I don't even like calling it a debate because I think it's beneath the dignity of the word debate, but the so-called debate between creationists, people like Ken Ham and that lot, and those who want to advocate for a more Darwinian framework. So
yeah.
The typical creationist, of course you can always find an exception, in my view, though, is ironically modern in his presuppositions. Like even his approach to the biblical text itself, insisting on a kind of thoroughgoing literalism, reflects a relationship with the text and even with the world, which is inherited directly from the Enlightenment, which is, in fact, hostile to a pre-modern, if you like, or pre-Enlightenment way of seeing the same text. And so there's a profound, perhaps, I would say that there's a profound dishonesty there. So in this respect, I think, we're pretty much on the same page, where you have a stated rejection of something like the Enlightenment, but to what it's really tantamount is a pretext for emotionalism.
Yeah, well, I think it's easy when you take an example like the creationists to get most progressive people to agree that the Enlightenment should be something that we cling to, that reason and scientific evidence and rational thought are all things that we want to hold on to as a shield against the ideas of, say, far-right creationists. But it's not as easy to hold those same standards when it comes to our own ideas or to how we approach critics of the Enlightenment. So, as an example, recently I gave a presentation on Adorno and Marx. I was at the Pacific Northwest College of Art, and we were talking about the critique of the Gotha program as compared to Adorno's chapter out of his book, Dialectics of the Enlightenment, I think, called On the Culture Industry. And what I saw was in that piece a rejection of technology that went further than I think was warranted, because Adorno hadn't been rigorous enough in at least explicating the economic critique, which was the basis of his rejection of actually existing technology and society. So Marx has a critique of technology that's different than Adorno's. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask if you could maybe sort of sketch Adorno's argument, for the sake both of the audience and for refreshing my memory.
Well,
and then we can talk about
I can summarize it, but I wish I should have pulled up the essay and grabbed the quote before we start talking. But what I'll say is that what Adorno does. Hold on, let me turn off my phone. Hold on one second.
No worries. What's interesting here is the juxtaposition of Adorno's critique of the Enlightenment with the Marxian view of technology.
So what Adorno does is he starts with a critique of capitalism. It starts from a Marxist perspective, but in that book ends up critiquing all of the Enlightenment. And I think his main point is that what is called the Enlightenment, or deems itself to be Enlightenment thinking or reason, is actually always put into the service of the economic and political basis of the society that we're in. So technology and reasoned discourse always has this sort of secondary or unstated objective of servicing an economy, which may not be at base, and isn't. I don't think at base a rational system. It isn't, and certainly isn't consistent or non-contradictory. But rather than demonstrate how the economy undermines our own efforts to reach for the Enlightenment and truly take control of our lives collectively and individually, Adorno launches a critique of reason itself and of the Enlightenment itself. And with technology, he simply says that all technological thinking is thinking in service of a commodity culture, or in service of the creation of and the sale of commodities, including in the cultural realm.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge in that book, it's been a while for me, though, was that, I mean, it's actually, to me, like an incredibly depressing book, because one who walks away from it almost with an impression that you cannot escape the commodity logic, that it is ubiquitous and constricting in a way which almost paints one's sense of resistance to it as childishly significant, right? Not that that was strictly Adorno's intent, but in that volume, that is sort of, where one arrives and where one feels that the only response is one of almost unmitigated negation. And insofar as you inherit that impression from the text, which, as I recall, interestingly, actually correlates the early developments of the Enlightenment in the scientific project with the practice of magic in the medieval era. And in fact, there are some fascinating conceptual linkages there, a sort of a preoccupation with control and dominance and so forth. But there's actually more logical space, as you have been intimating, than one actually gets from that particular text in Adorno. Right? Okay, so yes, you have technology, and yes, this technology is often wedded to a capitalist framework or commodity logic, but you can actually abstract the notion of technology so that it is not connected merely to that framework. And in fact, I think Marx, though sometimes he himself has been critiqued as determinist in this regard, had a greater sense of it when he talked about, this is something which I encountered in David Harvey's reading of Marx. It's not that technology so much determines as it discloses what's going on, right? So if you look at how technology develops in ways which are conducive to sort of Taylorization or the implementation of scale economies and that kind of thing, which follow directly from a concern with the reproduction and expansion of surplus value or profit, then you can see how this process of disclosure is, or a way of seeing technology as disclosing rather than determining, is perhaps helpful to us. But that doesn't mean that you reject technology. Instead, what it means is you have to look at more closely at why is it that we are developing technologies along these lines as opposed to along other lines. And oftentimes the answer to that why is outside of the province of technology, which connects to what do you mean by, well, I'm making a few jumps But that connects back to the question of the Enlightenment, right? And the question of science, the relationship between science and technology, knowledge and technology.
Mm-hmm.
Do science and knowledge and the pursuits that they advocate, are they inextricably connected with the mentality of capitalism? I mean, to me, the answer to that is pretty patently no. But there are those who would resist that optimism. What do you think?
Well, I don't think that technology and science are. I think they are linked today. There's no doubt that the technology that exists today and that the kind of science that's done today, especially science that's done beyond just the level of pure research, that all of that is done in the service of the commodity culture and the service of capitalist society as it is. I do believe that it would be possible to continue on traditions of science and technology in a different kind of society, say a communist society, a true communist society, if we can imagine such a thing. And it's questionable whether we can. But I think it's worth pointing out that this distinction between technology that discloses something and technology that determines something, that distinction is real. It's a real distinction. You can see the difference between the kinds of technology, but we need not even abandon a goal of creating technology that would determine our social relations in order to escape from capitalism. Not just like computer technology or manufacturing technology, but technologies of forms of discourse or forms of inquiry. These can still be determining, and yet not capitalist and not necessarily to be rejected out of hand. I think the idea that one of the ideas that Adorno wants to reject, I think, is the idea that we should live in societies of control, or that we should live in societies where our interactions or social interactions are somewhat determined or controlled. And I don't believe that we. Not only don't I believe that we should strive not to have those determining factors. I don't think it's possible for us to break from some sort of social structure which sets limits and controls on the human population. I'm sort of with Freud on this. I think that's what it means to be civilized, is that you live in a world where some part of your discourse and some part of your interactions are controlled. In order to have a form, just even to kind of be recognizable, you need these structures of control.
Well, I don't know where I bridle is the word control. I mean, that's a point that Camus makes centrally in his work too, is that you need a limit. That true intelligence is marked not by excess, but by a capacity for restraint. In fact, it's almost, to go way back, it's also a kind of Aristotelian approach to the intelligence, where you have the idea that virtue is the embodiment of a mean and a moderation, right? So there's this sensitivity within the tradition. The word control, maybe it's just because it's sort of like emotionally loaded, though strikes me as inadvisable. Perhaps because, in my view, a relationship of control actually precludes the exercise of intelligence. Intelligence has to attain or realize the operation of limits within a situation. But in order to have the openness to make that discernment effective, it can't be manacled by extrinsic factors, right? So there's a kind of paradox at hand. I think that in order to really be able, in a given situation, to act in the appropriate fashion, you have to be free from factors which will preclude you from embodying what you discern to be the correct course of action. There's actually a saw, this is actually a saying from the Tibetan tradition, that you should never act out of obligation, because then you can only react. You're going to lose your ability to be nuanced in your grasp of what's in front of you. So that's, perhaps a bit rambling, but I'm
interested in that Tibetan wisdom, but so maybe we can come back to that. The way I tend to think of it is like this: when you are aware of the ways in which you're being controlled, and those things are explicit, I think that you have more freedom than when you're not aware of those systems and of control.
Right. I think that's pretty straightforward.
So the goal from my point of view is to take what right now is operating almost always in the background in a way in which seems unquestionable, and put that into the foreground, make it an object of public awareness, make it an object which we use in order to control and determine our relationships, but which we do so with full conscious awareness, so that when things go wrong, we have the ability to critique how our own systems of control are contradictory or are insufficient. So that's, like if you're going to replace capitalist society, you can't just get rid of capitalism. You have to create a new society, a new structure for the world to operate on. And that would be some sort of system of control, of distribution, production. Hopefully, what I'd like to see, and I don't know if this is possible, what I'd like to see is a future in which some of the good things that capitalism gives us, like its ability to bring many people together to cooperate on one large project, to create commodities for the masses, to put it in capitalist language. I would like to hold on to some of that. I'd like to. I don't want to see communism be a retreat to subsistence farming, say.
Right.
So
I think that's maybe where your anxieties about the Enlightenment arise.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
That people think that if they draw the inference that the rejection of capitalism entails the rejection of all these other things, such as certain kinds of technology, certain sorts of scientific modality, which are then conjoined with the Enlightenment, and then which draws out the idea that the Enlightenment itself has to be rejected, and you have to enter into sort of a primitivistic universe. And I agree that's a flawed approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's still a problem to figure out like how to organize our production along the line so that we can bring a lot of people together, get them to cooperate, produce mass amounts of goods or produce big projects without having the kind of economic inequality in place that capitalism requires, so that we can have free workers, basically.
Right. You see, the thing that comes to my mind, and when you say that, is like, how are we going to deal with the problems of money? So, like, if you ask the question, well, what is it about capitalism that has facilitated such remarkable coordination of resource that you have this almost, in fact, by definition, unchecked growth of surplus value. If I say it's unchecked, I don't mean that it's unchecked by material conditions. I mean aspirationally capitalism, the framework, not necessarily a given individual within it, seeks to always grow. That's
Yeah.
that's what. And under or within that framework, the coordinating or the mediating technology is the technology of money. And what's difficult, and this perhaps you'll say here, is it connects to the question of consciousness, because the coordinating processes of capitalism, which enable these large-scale projects, are largely unconscious in nature, or they rely on a very primitive level of consciousness, the consciousness of the market, which is largely hedonic or pleasure oriented in nature. And this, so I guess it's not quite unconscious, but it's a very sort of basic level of consciousness, which is sort of short-sighted, and then gives rise to these growths that, because they're not undertaken with a sense of what's happening more broadly, create things like environmental catastrophe or gross maldistribution of income and all the rest of it, right? So the counterpoint to me is like the alternative possibility, which suggests itself to me, is the notion of a radical democracy. I say radical democracy because the representative framework just isn't going to cut it. The representative framework creates a barrier to genuine participation, which interferes with our ability as human beings, as intelligent human beings, to cooperate with each other in a conscious way that would then interdict the operation of capital in a way that gives rise to things like Flint, Michigan, or the tragedy in Bhopal, India, in the 80s, or so forth. But how do you get radical democracy? And then I think that's where you come up against a cultural problem, broadly speaking.
So
how do you get people? Go ahead.
I'm not sure if we have left behind the question about the Enlightenment or not at this point, but it's interesting.
I mean, is it sort of in the back?
Yeah, it's in the background. Okay, so to me, what's interesting about what you just said is you said a couple of different things. You said two things where I don't think necessarily the second thing you said followed directly from the first. But the first thing I heard you saying was that the problem we have in society now is that the commodity culture that we live in produces consumers who are focused on their own individual pleasures and who are not as involved in, say, their own communities, or certainly in the mass of society, the large picture of society, on the level that they should be. They are they're content to be unaware about all the consequences of their own lives, say. Would you agree with that's part of what you were saying?
Yeah, it's certainly part, though I don't want to reduce it to just an issue of consumerism. I think It has to do with the fact that the market demand, like look at the case of China, all right, where I just read this remarkable statistic. From 2011 to 2013, in 2 years, they poured something like 6,650 million tons of cement in 2 years. The U.S., over the course of the whole 20th century, from 1900 to 1999, only poured 4,400 some million tons. So in 2 years, the Chinese poured 1.5 times as much cement as the U.S. did in the whole of the 20th century. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a burgeoning consumerism in China, but that's not really what's responsible for that enormous growth. It's the Chinese responding to the imperative of the market in a way which is more than just hedonistic. There are other obvious factors involved there, but there's a sense of exigency. It's a sense that they had to do this. It's the only way to respond to the situation. It's like a failure of imagination at hand, which is almost unfathomable.
So first of all, I'm not sure that I'm against pouring all that cement. I'll just say that. I mean, it depends on what they're going to do with all that cement, right? But the second thing is that I wanted to get to is even when you just talk about the market, you may not be talking about individual consumers. You may be talking about larger structures, but you're still talking about distribution.
I am.
Yeah, and
yes.
the other side of this, that what we don't think about as much, is the realm of production, and the Marxist critique of society is not that people are too caught up in their hedonistic pleasures in the marketplace, or that they are constrained by advertising from seeing the full political consequences of their lives, but that the majority of people have no property except their own ability to work. That's Marx's primary critique, and it doesn't have to do with how things are distributed, but with how things are made. So our current society operates on the level of having the majority of people unpropertied, at least when it comes to the kind of property which can produce commodities or can produce something for exchange. So people may have homes, but they're not property in terms of owning the means of production. So when you have a large class of people who have nothing to sell but their labor time, you have a society based on exploitation, with all the contradictions that implies, and you have problems of distribution and inequality, but they're founded at the level of production. The inequality exists from the start. It's not only in the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two sides to that critique. There's the side that you just enumerated, but then there's the fact that the two are inextricable. That the logic of the market and the logic of production are wedded.
Oh yeah.
So what I mean by that is that what drives production is the pursuit of exchange value, which is realized in the market, as opposed to use value, which is the address of concrete human needs.
Yeah, but when you talk about hedonism, you're talking about use values. That's the thing that I think is most interesting, or the thing that I want to get away from, is that when you talk about the problems of consumers' consciousness being shaped by their hedonistic desires that are being acted out in the marketplace, you're actually talking about their pursuit of use values, because most consumers, they're not buying things to sell again. They're buying things to feed themselves or to use in their own lives. And none of that's not what capitalism is founded on. Capitalism is founded on production of commodities for exchange, and where the main goal is the exchange rather than the use. Marx talks about it as MCM process, where you have money, you create a commodity to sell, and you have more money.
You're quite correct there, and that's true. So I need to at least modify.
Well, it's not just you. It's not just you. It's like I would say a lot of Marxists, including Adorno, after the World War II, kind of played around a little bit, lost some of their economic terms, because they were so discouraged by what had happened in the 20th century and looking for, I think, scapegoats, but reasons why there wasn't a larger revolution. And so they started to turn to basically theories and ideas that didn't take on or didn't incorporate Marx's economic critique. Not that these other ideas are all completely wrong. They're not. I think there's a lot to get out of Freud and others, but that they acted as though these other theories, which were critiquing human psychology on the level of individual use values, say, and on the level of lived experience, were in some fundamental way also Marxist, or also critiques of the economy, or also critiques of capitalism. And I don't think that's really true.
Well, I think that they're there's a point of connection maybe through the notion in Marx of how the fetish of the commodity and that phenomenon whereby we do have a certain sense of reality that is connected with these operations, but we don't really think of it operationally. This whole sort of ugly underbelly of the reality of how the sphere of production is where exploitation originates is concealed by the fashion in which, as the classic language goes, social relations become material and material relations become social, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Right.
An
Okay.
inversion.
Right.
So I think that it's within the space of that inversion that the anxieties of how we conceive of ourselves culturally are involved in a critique of capitalism. Then not saying that, by the way, to your concern, which I think is one which deserves significant consideration. At all event, well, I think you wanted to say something else about the Enlightenment. So
I wanted to say something about the fetish nature of the commodity, which I think you described it well. But at the beginning, I was concerned that you were going to talk about the fetish quality of a commodity as if the commodity was an ideology. What's weird about the fetish quality that the commodity has is that, and I think Zizek talks about this, is that the commodity actually does have magical powers in capitalist society, meaning that it really does take over our social relations for us. It's not as though we misunderstand the significance of the commodity or place too much faith in the commodity and are confused about the reality of the world. The truth is, through our own social institutions and our economic institutions, the commodity does in fact mediate our social relationships, and it does so through the commodity of money, and all of the financial speculation, all of this very complicated realm works to direct our lived experience, and so the commodity truly is a fetish in so much as it is a materialized ideology. It is an ideology made into forces in the world. And then I'll stop.
Well, that's okay. I was just going to sort of add, I think, a really great sphere to look to sort of see this in sharp relief is healthcare. You know, right? Where what's the use value? The use value is addressing people who are ill, who are injured, in pain, who need a redress. Okay, so there's a very, tangible set of needs that have to be addressed. But then when you hear the vocabulary, sometimes it's like fingernails on the chalkboard, and they talk about healthcare as something which somebody consumes, or how that whole process, which is rending and uncomfortable and part of what it is to be a human being, both individually and in your relationship, is then sort of perverted by making the decisions which we're arriving dependent on commodification, right? So that's like the power of the commodity fetish really arises where we're willing to let people suffer and die, because we feel literally constrained by the force of commodity logic. And so there, like, the material potency of that logic comes to light.
I would just say not only do we feel constrained, but we actually are constrained by commodity logic. I have a cousin whose husband produces medical equipment, and he makes a quite a nice living as a owner of a kind of small scale manufacturer of very detailed, or I was going to say ornate, but precise is the right word. Very precise, highly specialized tools for medical professionals, for surgery and all sorts of interventions. And he runs a metalworking shop to produce these tools. And he has, non-union labor produce these tools, but they could have been unionized. It doesn't matter, actually. But he has employees who produce the tools. In order to make a profit, they're highly paid, for manufacturers, for people working in that kind of assembly line, because it's such a small shop and it does require so much skill. They're highly paid, but even so, they are still exploited for their labor, and he's making a profit based on exploiting these highly skilled craftsmen's labor and their time. And it's given that that's the case, that he produces these tools for profit, to implement those tools has a cost, which has to be paid for one way or another, whether it's through the state or through individuals. And medical care in this society doesn't escape the logic of the commodity. It just doesn't. We would like it to. We don't want it to come down to whether you can pay for your health care. We think that should be a universal right. But the only way that it could be a universal right is if the economy was booming to such a degree that we could maintain enough of a state control over some of the surplus to afford universal health care for everyone, which isn't the case right now on a global level. It is in some parts of Europe, and in the United States, maybe could be. But anyhow.
But it's interesting is that there's a very real conceivability there. Like, if you take the logic of commodity out of the picture for a moment, like as a thought experiment, right? You can conceive that the material and the intellectual capacity is clearly present so that we can have at least a very close approximation to universally available healthcare. And so the real impediment isn't a physical or intellectual scarcity. It's a scarcity which is produced by our enthrallment before the logic of the commodity. And so that's what drives me absolutely batty.
Yeah, but the contradictory thing is, it's the enthrallment to this commodity logic that stops us from using our intellectual and physical capacities to their fullest and producing enough for everyone to create something like a post-scarcity society. That's being held in check by the commodity logic. At the same time, the abilities that we have, the tools that we have, the understanding that we have so far has been an outcome of this very logic. The reason these tools were produced was because my cousin's husband could bring people together in a factory setting and produce them. And so we don't have an alternative economics set up. We will have to create that. We can't just simply, at least I can't.
I'm not disputing.
Right, I know, but I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying it's worth pointing out, and underlining that, which is why I think the Enlightenment again is so important, and not just a negative Enlightenment where you critique systems of control, but a positive one where you try to create new systems of new economies, new systems of control, new systems of self-organization, so that you can continue to develop and go beyond, transcend capitalism and its level of scientific understanding, rather than retreat from the whole project.
So I was just trying to think what to ask you next, and so there was something else. I had said A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you said, well, there's two things there. The one thing, and then you pointed to the problematic about emphasizing
consumerism. The second thing was
consumerism.
radical democracy, right?
Right.
So
Right. And then
radical democracy, if radical democracy is a political idea, which is not a bad one. It's I was an anarchist for years and years, but the thing about radical democracy is we could have radical democracy conceivably. I don't know if it would actually function, but we could have radical democracy, decentralized federations of councils, which would determine our laws and determine our regulations. And if we were still producing things in a capitalist economy, many of the problems that we have would not go away. Radical democracy is not a full solution to the problem of capitalism.
Well, so
it's not like it's a bad thing. It just isn't
no.
enough.
I mean, I see what you're saying. I mean, I think part of the challenge is for it to work, it has to work everywhere, right? So, like, you could have like a little radical democracy cell in New England or Oregon somewhere, like a city that decides it's going to. But then the fact that we're all hooked into this network would translate into incredibly corrosive pressures on that locality that would probably ultimately submarine its aspirations to radical democratic instantiation. So there's the A to B problem. Like, oh, well, that's great. Everybody would like it to be that way, but how do you get from where we are to there? And that's part of perhaps what your concerns are. I don't think that that's all of it, right? Again, it recurs to this problem of how do we challenge the commodity logic. The reason I think that radical democracy is at least a significant portion of the solution, is that the question of production and the question of resource allocation is a question that cannot be left in the hands of isolated individuals, in my view. It is a question that has to be addressed communally. And thus my appeal to radical democracy as a political framework which could create a space for adjudication on those matters that was more conscious than the process of adjudication, if that word is even appropriate, such as it is undertaken in the marketplace.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm not sure what distribution would look like in a system that wasn't based on this commodity logic, where you have a majority of people have with no property and no control over the means of production, and having to work for a wage. If you didn't have that, what would the question of distribution be like? I mean, how would we handle distribution in a society that wasn't based on commodity production? We certainly probably wouldn't have money. Where would the primary realm of freedom be? Right now, the primary realm of freedom is in the marketplace, and in that realm of consumption. So would we just want to flip it and make the realm of freedom be in the realm of production, and then have some state, whether it's radically democratic or not, whether it's decentralized or not, have some political institution to determine where the items that we produced would be distributed, and who would get what? That's conceivable, but we have to start talking about both things at the same time. We can't just talk about distribution, and we can't just talk about production, although I think I tend to err in that direction. We have to talk about both at the same time. And
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's even just pragmatically the case, because what you're going to produce is going to be informed by to whom and where it's going to be distributed, and what are the okay. So they are connected, very, very physically connected. It's not just like out of obedience to some sort of intellectual protocol. I mean, my first blush response would be to say that what we have to do is we have to undercut this notion that the sphere of economy is autonomous, or I would maybe say that we have to, where is the space of freedom? I would say the space of freedom should be the political space. And so what we have to do if we want to make the economy a genuinely emancipatory one is politicize it. And I think you understand what I mean by that. I don't mean I mean that in a very broad sense. But I don't know either. I don't know. I really don't know, because it's just it just seems crazy that you have that one encounters a world of incredible material abundance, surplus. There's so much to go around, and yet even here in the U.S., which is sort of the heart of it all, you have incredible poverty. It's not on the same scale as say in certain parts of Africa or India, but there's real suffering here amid so much. It seems to me intolerable. It's how could this disjunction occur? And it's just a plaint. And I'm sorry if I don't have any. What do you think? What are some of the things that you think are part of the solution?
My thought
beyond
is what I'm doing to try to be part of the solution right now is have conversations like this one, where you point out in this sort of very straightforward, almost orthodox Marxist way that we need to think about things beyond just the level of distribution. We need to think about things beyond the level of a critique of consumerism, and that there's a creative project ahead of us, that it's not simply getting rid of the bad things in the world, that we have to create something new. I tend to like some ideas, that are floating around that are not often put as alternatives to capitalism, but I like the idea of gamification, where people would work together on collective projects to produce the world they live in as a kind of game. I can imagine factories where people would go, and it would be a productive day would be something along the lines of an amusement park or a day at the park. But this is my utopian science fiction mind, working.
Kind of Fourier. Was that sort of Fourier's thing? Work is play.
Yeah.
So no, I don't know much about him. But I just brought that.
Well, he influenced the Situationists too, who I quite like. So I come from that.
I really resonate with that notion. If I try to conceive of what constitutes an enjoyable life, is that enjoyment and play to me is when to me we're most, at least personally. I mean, it's not just all rainbow and unicorn, right? There's agony and the ecstasy, but the notion of monotony and toil is something which is inextricably part of life. That this is something we should just learn to accept is, in my view, unacceptable, right? And that's one of the things about capitalism, which I find so revolting, is that it seems to compel. I'm sorry.
You've worked in an office, huh? You must have worked in an office at some time in your life.
Ironically, I've only worked in an office significantly, two times, right? And the thing that drove me crazy about it is that it was incredibly pointless, right? It's what are these people? I don't understand what they do with their time, right? I was there for 4 or 5 months, and what would drive me crazy is I would run out of things to do.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to make up things to do, and it was all kind of just an exercise in futility, because there was nothing concretely being executed, right?
Yeah.
So the bureaucracy almost has to invent new things to fill up that time. At least
when you're doing
the factory, you're actually making something.
It can be tedious even when you're doing things. Like I worked in sales at Comcast. That was tedious. I was doing stuff. That was pretty bad. But I want to move over to this other thought that I had a while back and just bring it up now, which is that's okay. It was over the weekend. I was at a science fiction convention and I participated in a panel called, what was the name of the panel? It was something like what are the great questions of science fiction? And I thought we were going to sit down and debate, like try to figure out what the greatest question was, but instead it was just a list of questions that we all kind of went through, and that was a fun way to go about it. And one of the questions had to do with ultimately whether we thought that technology could come along to restructure society and change society. And this is when the Adorno in my head was shrieking, like I had to raise my hand at that point. Luckily, I was on the panel, so I was given a moment to speak. But I think that on the one hand, like people like Adorno and many on the left today are very quick to critique technology and reject technology in ways that I don't think are helpful. On the other hand, most people, like in the realm of science fiction writing, tend to think of technology as a great force for positive change, and reason as a great force for positive change, without understanding exactly Adorno's first very primary point, which is all of our technology is aimed at capitalism. And so what I pointed out was that we couldn't imagine what we tried to imagine as science fiction writers was some, say, AI that came along and just thought through everything and solved everything for us. Just sort of omnipotence would solve the problem. But I pointed to this old Star Trek episode called Charlie X. Although another one was called Where No Man Has Gone Before, I think, is another example, where human beings are given omnipotence, but are ill-equipped to handle that much power, that they find themselves overwhelmed by that much power. Charlie X is one he's a teenager who can just think things into existence, but he needs some support, psychological support. He's turning to the Captain Kirk, as sort of a father figure to try to get guidance from him. And I tend to think of the economic realm as that realm that's sort of like Captain Kirk and Charlie X. It's where we look to, maybe without knowledge of it a good portion of the time, to set the foundation, the ground for our own understanding and our own attempts to live and our own attempts at knowledge. And that the tricky thing that an AI won't be able to necessarily do for us unless we program it to, is to set up those terms of the ground, to decide who's going to be our Captain Kirk and why. So I'm not sure if that made any sense or not.
It does. I mean, the metaphor is perhaps worthy of expansion, because if we're Charlie X, and we're turning to the economic sphere to give us guidance in the application of our power, then we, I think, have chosen, at least under the economic sphere's present configuration, a very problematic tutor. Okay. But in a way, it's problematic for the same reason that appeal to artificial intelligence is problematic. The terms of the economic framework are such that they are not able to give the guidance that we're seeking. Similarly, no artificial intelligence would be capable of providing that guidance either. And even if it was, or even if you had an appeal to some sort of, quasi-supernatural entity, who had such thing, I don't even think it would be appropriate. I think that ultimately what you're doing is you're evading responsibility. Okay, well, that's actually what bothers me about lots of appeals to technology and AI, is that, the machine can figure it out for us. It's like, well, I think part of the point,
Well, wait,
the
if
line,
they're only going to think what we programmed them to think, right? So if
Right.
we created a sentient AI, it would mean that we had thought up something, we had changed as well as the computer. It's not like this is our own creation, really. And so, like, if I came across an AI that could give me answers to any of the, like, to these questions about capitalism, that wouldn't mean that it would give me those answers. I'd have to ask it the right questions, or program the right questions into it.
Right. I agree. What I was doing is I was sort of trying to be generous to the AI thesis and see if the artificial intelligence is genuinely sentient and creative and perhaps capable of proffering notions at which we might not actually arrive of our own accord. That actually doesn't. I mean, we're nowhere close, I don't think, to anything like that. But even if we could be, I'm trying to say, even if you had that sort of thing in principle, existentially, do you want? It's like, do you really want to ask God for the answers? Right, just out of it, the AI.
Have you ever read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
I did, but it's many years ago. Many years ago.
You're like the philosopher in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. They create an AI that can answer any question. It's called Deep Thought, and they go to it to ask it the question of the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. Right, and before they can get the question out, there's a group of protesting philosophers who say, "We insist upon our right to be confused. We refuse to receive the answer. We insist upon our right to possibly or possibly not be confused. I may or may not be a philosopher."
I'm willing. I'm be a willing participant in that protest, right? Because as a subject, right? I just it just doesn't. It's not very systematic. It just doesn't feel right. There's something that doesn't feel right about it.
Right. Well, what happens is the computer says, "Don't worry, it will take me. I can give you the answer, but it'll take me 20 million years to do the computation." And but you have plenty of time to be wrong. Yes. And then when the answer does come, it's a simple answer. The answer is 42, and then, of course, they realize that they didn't really know what question they were asking to begin with. So they have to create a bigger computer to find out what the question is for the answer to the meaning of life. So to ask the question about the life of the universe and everything the right way. Because the computer can give you the answer at 42, but it can't give you the question.
It's all about the question.
Yeah.
It's all about the question.
Yeah.
And it's actually very troubling to me, this whole question of technology, because I fully admit that technology is a positive good. I'm a diabetic, for example, right? And as a consequence, I have to have insulin, and there are things available now, like pumps and so forth, which make the management of the condition, far easier than it was even like 20 years ago, right? Okay.
How long have you been a diabetic? Are you type 1 or type 2?
I'm a type 1.
Yeah.
I was diagnosed when I was like 9. I mean, there's like a concrete example in my own life of how, I can see the positive good of technology. Otherwise I'd probably be dead, or I'd be in very bad shape at this point. But on the other hand, so often in our conversation, I think we just give it way too much weight, where we're trying to make it do work that it can't do. Like it can't do it structurally. It's not that it's bad, right? It's you're trying to use technology to answer questions that it can't answer. Questions like death and our mortality, which is kind of, people that, in my view, are almost cartoons, but in their position, like the transhumanists that exemplify it. And this sort of where we feel like we can move beyond the human into this sort of quasi immortality in a database or something like that. And it to me is an utter evasion of actual life, of actual experience. And I'm not going to fault the technology for it. It's not the technology's fault. It's our unwillingness to engage what it means to be really free, which is at hand here, in my view.
Well,
so
it's funny you should bring up the at this science fiction convention. There was definitely a strong transhumanist sentiment in the audience, especially for that panel. And you and I have discussed this immortality quest before on Facebook, and I'm interviewed one of the leading figures in the quest to create an indefinite lifespan, this guy Aubrey de Grey. And I think it's a really interesting question. One of the things that's important to point out about, say, Aubrey de Grey's work is that if he were successful and he could offer a medical intervention into the process of aging, where someone who is 70 could get a treatment and have their body restored to the age of, say, 30 or 25 or something beautiful and wonderful like that. Even if that were to occur, that would not be a step towards immortality. There is no step towards immortality. There's just what it would do is change the conditions for our death. It would make our death less assured. We would not know when or how we would be destroyed.
There are though transhumanists who actually advocate for potential immortality, right? They talk about things like transferring our conscious to a machine and that kind of thing. And but the distinction that you're introducing is non-trivial, right? And I think it would be dishonest. Personally, I think it would be dishonest to though I've met people who make this claim and I don't believe them. It would be dishonest to pretend that that aging is all great, because it's not. Okay,
right.
And I think if you're you don't have to be particularly old to see that it's not all great. Okay, I think by the time you get into your late 20s, you start to see that you're not dying at 29, but you can see a difference between 29 to 21, which is sufficient to ground a certain distaste for the aging process. That's
and at 45, I really freaking hate the aging process. I'm really beginning to notice it, and I don't like it. But
you're right. So that kind of thing, that's I think it's fine, right? The problem is that or improving the conditions whereunder we're going to be dealing with the ultimate inevitability of our death. Okay. Or at least severe impairment. That's salutary. Okay. However, I still feel that most of the time those projects are not being undertaken with the idea that they're actually creating a more propitious world in which to engage the mystery of existence. But of course, I could be wrong. That's just my impression.
Well, I think you're.
And it may actually.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, in a sense, in my view, what really strikes me about the transhumanists is that they are almost like hyper-Cartesian, because Descartes talked about how the reason he was willing to sort of stick his neck out on behalf of advocating for the scientific process was precisely so that we could learn to control nature and extend pleasure, diminish pain, and this is explicit. I'm not like inferring. This is what he says in the discourse, right? And even extend our life potentially indefinitely. He all but says that, right? You know, so there are, you know, if you can join that, ironically enough, with his hard dualism of mind and body, you can almost see them as instantiating or as an epitomization of a certain limited feature of the Enlightenment. I don't want to reduce the Enlightenment to those terms, right? But what's interesting about it is that when you can join that alarming concern with what you just stated, that look, you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some things which are being undertaken within that motif, which are still, you know, perhaps beneficial. You know, like if we could all be 25 again or something like that, you know, but you know, there's a balance to be struck.
Well, we wouldn't be 25 again, even if we physically had, you know, I mean, I suppose it's possible we could actually be, you know, our brains could be restructured and we would think the same way as we did when we were 25, which would be, I think, a trade-off that maybe some people wouldn't want to take. You know, at that point, if you actually had to literally be 25 again, it wouldn't be worth it, right? Or maybe it would. Yeah, but you wouldn't be 25 again. You'd be as healthy as you were when you were 25, say, and hopefully you were healthy then. Not everybody is, but yeah. So what I think is true about what you were saying before, critiquing the transhumanists before, is that they do not have any kind of real answers beyond, say, hedonism as to like how to make sense of the meaning of our lives. And the problem of that, of generating meaning and for your life, isn't something that even indefinite life extension is going to address. In fact, it may make it worse. It may make the problem even more profound because it's taking one more reliable fact about the world away from us. You know,
right. Not having an obvious deadline could almost lead to a rather lifeless odiosity, you know, or something like that. You know, it would be like, what's the point of being alive? So, you know, if you couldn't die, would life itself become a prison? So,
right. And also, there's a chance. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, if that could happen, I also think there's a chance that things wouldn't change, or that that fashions wouldn't change, or that sensibilities wouldn't change as quickly. I tend to think that would be that people would be more open to change if they weren't concerned about proving that their previous existence had been, you know, correct and hadn't been wasted. Like that careerism might be diminished a bit if you had a longer life to live. You'd be more likely to correct mistakes you might have made and less likely to double down on early mistakes. But who knows? I think it would be a positive thing overall, but it would certainly come with, I think it would be maybe experienced as deflationary.
Yes. And of course there would be unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And all in all, at best, you know, it just sort of puts things off, and it's not coming anytime soon. So as long as we're here and now, we should just go ahead and take up the hard work of meaning as it presents itself.
Yeah, well, there's no getting around it. Even if it were here tomorrow, that hard work would still be there. And part of the hard work would be figuring out how to rearrange or change our social structures, because you can't divorce the idea of creating meaning in your life from how we live and how we live, you know, together. Those things are connected.
So it seems this is probably a natural point at which to take a kind of break in any event, since we've been talking for about an hour.
Okay.
So, do you want to say anything to sort of wrap it up, Doug?
No, I've enjoyed this conversation. I think that I guess I will say this, that I think that if I have any particular message, it's just that people should be less inclined to dismiss Descartes even and the Enlightenment than they are. I think that there's been over the last 50 or so years a transformation of a legitimate critique of Enlightenment into almost a pose of just of pessimism for its own sake. It's maybe this sort of Gnostic approach, like I reject the world, including the world of technology.
Right. The thing about that is this is almost true, not just of like critiques of the Enlightenment, but almost any critique which I encounter, even a critique with which I disagree, right? So, or with which I agree, right? So, like, or even like take people who sort of want to dismiss postmodernism, or the postmodernists, they had it all wrong. There's like, you can thank the postmodernists for nihilism, and you can go ahead and send all those French deconstructionists to hell.
No, it's
really, but I'm not. No, I don't think that.
No.
Okay, but there are people who say that sort of thing.
Right.
But then that doesn't appreciate that even if you have all sorts of problems with people who are postmodernists or deconstructionists or whatever it is, you have to take them seriously. There's a laziness of thought across the whole spectrum, which is, I think, very problematic.
Yeah.
So I apparently said something to really upset you there. I'm sorry.
No. I just idea that nihilism is a result of postmodernism. It's like, so wrong.
I know.
Postmodernism is a response to the problems of the Enlightenment, which in nihilism is always going to be in the background for the Enlightenment project. And postmodernism, the way I think of it is, it's just another failed Enlightenment project. It's just another attempt to try to square the circle. And the only problem that I have with it really is that people cling to it when the argumentation starts to refute itself. When, like, I think Derrida is interesting, say, but he ultimately isn't coherent, and that he makes mistakes that even earlier thinkers don't. But that doesn't mean that because of him, it's all his fault that there's nihilism in the world. It's just getting everything backwards. The world exists with these problems, and philosophers come along and try to understand them and think them through. And if they're successful, they may have some sway over changing the way the world works. But it's certainly not. It doesn't start with the philosophers. It starts with the way we live, and then philosophers try to come along after the fact and figure it out. So it's wrong to judge and blame the postmodernists. I'm much happier blaming, pop culture even for nihilism than I am with postmodernists. Come on. But I don't think that's right either, but it makes more sense.
But the point is that people are making an effort. You have to take people seriously, right? Yeah. I think that's my real concern, is that people don't take other people seriously. Which that just exacerbates problems of alienation and really leads to regress that we can't abide. So
yeah. Well, it was great talking to you. Do you want to take a break and come back, or did you want to just leave it here for now?
We can just leave it here for now.
Okay.
These are the sorts of questions which aren't amenable to tidy conclusions. So.
No, I don't think so.
But
I was glad to come on and talk, and let me know when this has been live, and there have been a few people watching, I guess, or
it looks like, I think Cam watching South Africa.
Cool.
So hi, Cam. So a few people have been in and out, but I will send you the link, and I'll probably be available here on Blab within a few minutes. But I'll send you the link when they send me an email, and then I'll put it up on YouTube, and you can do what you want with the files. I'll forward them to you.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, man. We'll
All
talk
right.
to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.